She was a teacher of middle school English for 30 years in Kenmore in the Buffalo region. And I've asked her, and she's agreed to talk briefly about and certainly sell copies of the two books that she has written. The one she wrote for last season called The Chautauqua Institution from 1874 to 1974. It's from the Images of America series. And the book she and Jane Curry recently published is the Chautauqua Lake region. So I asked her to just do a brief mention of those, and afterwards, if you're interested, as I said, she will sign a copy of that if you're so interested, or talk with you about that book or about this week's selection, Last Witnesses. The CLSC manager, Kathleen Crocker.
Several people have already been in today to buy this week's selection, knowing that it's featured. The book looks like this, and interestingly enough, it was written long before September 11th. It's called Last Witnesses, Reflections on the Wartime Internment of Japanese Americans by Erica Hart. She's an editor. This is the book itself. Joan Brown Campbell and I speaking at the same time. How exciting. I want to welcome you to the third Brown Bag review of the 2002 season. And as always, it's a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to review a book in this capacity and share my understanding and interest in it with you. And I've been looking forward to this particular review because, and I started this lesson plan of sorts back in May, and I can explain why. Since learning of the book last summer, when Erica Hart herself called us at the veranda to find out the process of selecting CLSC books, I've been intrigued with her timely topic, and that's exactly what it is. This year is the 60th anniversary of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Executive Order number 9066 that negatively impacted over 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry, as well as our American system of justice. I started to pass around, and it may not reach all of you, and if it doesn't, you can stop by the veranda. I laminated a copy of the order itself, a copy of Ford's proclamation about the American promise, and the map of the internment camps in the United States. So if it doesn't get around, come to the veranda and take a look at it, because I think it will help you a little bit. According to Roger Daniels, a former history department chair at SUNY Fredonia and a respected scholar on the topic, quote, "It was the first, and so far the only time that the American government has violated en masse the rights of an ethnic group, second and third generation Japanese Americans, to which its constitution had given citizenship." About 10 years ago, I introduced this collection of beautifully written and illustrated stories and poems, The Big Book of Peace, to my middle school students. It was published for the express purpose of conveying the wisdom of peace and the absurdity of war, and its proceeds were donated to peace organizations including Amnesty International, Greenpeace, and the Carter Center Conflict Resolution Program. And I've never forgotten the 5-page selection entitled Letter from a Concentration Camp, in which Jimbo Kurosaki wrote to his friend Hermie Schnabel about his experiences in one of these jail-like internment camps. "What I want to know," he writes, "is what am I doing here anyway? Me, a genuine born in California citizen of the United States of America, stuck behind barbed wire just because I look like the enemy in Japan. How come you're not here too, with that German blood in your veins? We're at war with Germany too, aren't we?" And then he continued in his letter, "Ask Mrs. Wilford about that stuff she taught us in 6th grade about the Bill of Rights and due process of law. I guess President Roosevelt forgot about the Constitution when he ordered us into concentration camps. War makes people crazy." And this story was an eye-opener for me and for my 6th and 7th grade students. I was shocked that I was unaware of this dark period in American history, and I've since tried to figure out why I was ignorant about the topic, because to my mind, World War II had been very real to me and to my family. Images of my family huddled around the radio console, stunned at the news of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, were clear in my mind. My birth 1 month later, my father's war-related work at Bell Aircraft, our family victory garden in the outskirts of Buffalo, and rationing coupons, all of these had been discussed through the years. Moreover, I thought that my secondary and college history classes encompassed all that had transpired during the war, but not so. Since then, I've checked with many contemporaries, only to discover that history textbooks in the 50s and 60s made little or no mention of what they called this 3-year moral atrocity. Well, what was the silence all about? What made this subject taboo? But instead of researching this matter, it apparently had no relevance for me then with this book, because I didn't give it any more thought until Erica Hart called last summer, and her title jolted me, and then it piqued my curiosity. And though I plan to introduce you briefly to Erica Hart and her connection to the events, her reason for compiling this collection of essays and the book's format, but my emphasis for you is going to be on the missing pieces, the background data, to enable you to quickly grasp the complexity of the internment and its implications for the future. The book itself surely warrants our undivided attention, but as I said, in order to fully understand the 17 essays that are contributed by professional writers, scholars, activists, and students, 3 of whom, like Hart, are Caucasian children of the camp's administrators, it might be beneficial to briefly examine some of the key issues and players that caused this mass detention that, according to Hart, quote, was one of the most documented yet least known miscarriages of justice in our history, unquote. Only then will the severity and horrors exposed in this book be fully appreciated and understood. So, referring to the extensive bibliography in the back of her book, I was finally motivated this spring to take myself to Prendergast Library in Jamestown, which is an exceptionally fine library, so that I could understand more and then share with you the background information. Prior to World War II, several precedents had been set establishing white supremacy in our country. In 1857, Supreme Court Justice Roger B. Taney's decision in the Dred Scott versus Sanford case determined that non-whites essentially have no rights which the white man was bound to respect. In 1913, California's alien land law made it impossible for Japanese to own property in the state of California because aliens were ineligible for citizenship. And in the Supreme Court decision of Ozawa versus the United States, 1922, Orientals were barred from acquiring U.S. citizenship. And it wasn't until the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 that naturalization was finally offered to Asian immigrants. So not surprisingly, after the devastating defeat of the U.S. by Japan on December 7, 1941, the stage was already set for military empowerment. During his naval career, novelist James Michener was stationed for many years in Washington, D.C. In his introduction to the book, Years of Infamy, The Untold Story of America's Concentration Camps by Michelle Wiglin, which was published in 1976, Michener presented his perspective on the moral problem relating to the evacuation of the Japanese Americans on our West Coast, and revealed the many ways in which he had personally persevered over 30 years to justify what he called this curious, unjust, and unconstitutional behavior. It was tempting, he wrote, for the president, his military leaders, and most of his cabinet to utilize any psychological weapon that fell into their hands. If animosity and hatred could be directed against all Japanese, whether in Japan or in the United States, war might be more vigorously pursued. Especially in January and February of '42, when the fate of our nation swung in the balance. In addition, President FDR's Executive Order 9066, that's circulating somewhere, was based upon agricultural and economic interests in California. While becoming Americanized, Japanese men and women had converted marshes and deserts into profitable fields and orchards, providing competition with West Coast farmers. However, yellow peril propaganda, the notion that the United States needed to protect itself from internal security threats and sabotage by Japanese Americans living in the Pacific Coast states was what truly motivated the unique relocation and incarceration. Most of the reference sources that I checked out listed in her reading emphasize the irony of rounding up and imprisoning these Japanese Americans because the majority were harmless. They were infants, they were school-age children, and they were the elderly. Also, Japanese immigrants who had lived in the United States had not refused to become citizens. They had not chosen to maintain their loyalty to the Japanese emperor. In truth, they had no choice, since our government's policy was to deny them citizenship. So in essence, they were barred from becoming Americans, yet punished for remaining Japanese. Michener and other writers/researchers divulged the names of certain individuals who, in addition to FDR, should have received our wrath 60 years ago. I'll name three. One was Colonel Frank Knox, Secretary of the Navy during Roosevelt's administration. He was a former Chicago Daily News publisher, and he was pretty much responsible for creating a type of media frenzy. He used print blatantly to crusade against yellow peril and advocated internment. Another was Earl Warren, then Attorney General of California, who used the issue to political advantage prior to seeking governorship of that state. He's quoted as saying the Japanese, quote, may well be the Achilles heel of the entire civilian defense effort. Unless something is done, there might be a repeat of Pearl Harbor, unquote. And an interesting aside, of course, is that although Warren became one of the great Supreme Court justices, a staunch defender of individual rights, he would never publicly apologize for the wartime folly, his wartime folly, despite the pressure of the Japanese American community. And the third one, the onus probably lies most of all, however, with General John L. DeWitt, who was head of the Western Defense Command and considered a monomaniac to whom FDR handed over far too much authority. You'll remember in 1994, Ronald Takaki was one of our selections called A Different Mirror, The Making of a Multicultural America. He wrote another book, and in his 2000 publication, Double Victory, Takaki elaborated on DeWitt's involvement in the fateful decision, saying, quote, on January 4th, 1942, at a meeting of federal and state officials in his Presidio headquarters, DeWitt declared that military necessity justified the exclusion of the Japanese from the West Coast, saying, we are at war. This area, 8 states, has been designated as a theater of operations. There are approximately 288,000 enemy aliens, which we have to watch. I have little confidence that the enemy aliens are law-abiding or loyal in any sense of the word. Some of them, yes, many no, particularly the Japanese. I have no confidence in their loyalty whatsoever. DeWitt is also known as saying, a Jap is a Jap, once a Jap, always a Jap. He then talked about the second and third generation Japanese born on U.S. soil, decreeing that despite their citizenship and the fact they've become Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted. Despite numerous warnings after the attack of Pearl Harbor, including that of Congressman John Coffey of Washington on January 8, 1941, that America must refrain from making Japanese Americans, quote, victims of pogroms directed by self-proclaimed patriots and by hysterical self-anointed heroes, unquote, Roosevelt issued his heinous executive order 1 year later. The Department of War was then granted immediate and complete control over all alien enemies, although the words Japanese or Japanese Americans were not specifically mentioned. For the purpose of expediency, during a period when the U.S. military was extremely vulnerable, decision-making was delegated by President Roosevelt to persons who were not even elected officials. Michener pointed out that we Americans had been taught to hate, and many did to our eternal discredit. Of far greater significance was the dissenting opinion in the 1944 Korematsu case by U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson. And I'm finding many of you do not know that he's a native of Jamestown. There's a Jackson Center that's growing by leaps and bounds in Jamestown that you ought to look into. He was later the chief prosecutor of the war crime trials in Nuremberg, by the way. Refusing to comply with the president's executive order, Fred Korematsu, along with several other Japanese Americans, was subsequently arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. Their case was taken to the Supreme Court, which, by majority vote to Jackson's dismay, upheld the legality of the forced exile of citizens of Japanese ancestry. Learning firsthand that a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court was rare, Justice Jackson feared that the court, which voted to give legal sanction to the internment, in effect produced, quote, a loaded weapon for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim on an urgent need, unquote. As part of America's bicentennial celebration in 1976, President Gerald R. Ford issued Proclamation number 4417, an American Promise, calling FDR's order a setback to fundamental American principles. Moreover, it states that, quote, not only was that evacuation wrong, but Japanese Americans were and are loyal Americans. Ford concluded with these words, I call upon the American people to affirm with me this American promise, that we have learned from the tragedy of that long ago experience forever to treasure liberty and justice for each individual American, and resolve that this kind of action shall never again be repeated. But have we? Has the American government learned from the tragic internment precedent? Our government's act of betrayal was sanctioned by the highest court of the land, and bewilderingly remains on the books. Despite the redress movement, the struggle of Japanese Americans to receive compensation, both monetary and an apology for the loss of their freedom, one wonders if this travesty of justice could happen again. The consensus of my sources is that vulnerable minorities might be targeted anytime our government perceives a threat to internal security. We're all aware that racially motivated policies continue. Consider the increase in hate crimes and racial profiling. In Prisoners Without Trial, Japanese Americans in World War II, another expose by former SUNY Fredonia Professor Daniels, he cautioned that not only do inequities continue, but that, quote, politically explosive emotions exist among both the oppressed and the oppressors, unquote. Administrations since FDR's have exemplified this already. During President Carter's administration, the takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran affected Iranian college students living in our country. Many Haitian boat people were detained in a Miami camp during Reagan's term of office. In addition, what about FBI surveillance of the large Arab American population in Detroit that's been occurring? The minority targeted for their alleged alliance with Saddam Hussein and thus a threat to national security. These are good examples, Daniels would argue, of America's, quote, propensity to react against foreigners in the United States during times of external crisis, especially when those foreigners have dark skins. Unlike the timidity of the Japanese Americans, today's minorities are far more vocal and outspoken about inequality. Long before the terrorist attacks of September 11th, in May of 2000, to be exact, Dean Coldenhoven, mayor of Palos Heights, Illinois, likened the situation in his own community to the fate of the Japanese Americans after World War II. Firm in his conviction, and in defiance of the wrath of his fellow citizens, he supported several hundred members of his town's Islamic community who sought to purchase and convert a local Christian church into a mosque. Sacrificing his re-election in order to oppose discrimination and religious intolerance against these Muslims, Coldenhoven's moral courage and respect for diversity did not go unnoticed. In a ceremony in Boston this past May, Dean Coldenhoven, along with UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, received from Caroline Kennedy the Profile and Courage Award, presented annually to an elected official or public servant who in essence has withstood strong opposition to follow what he or she believes is the right course of action. During his term as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 1930 to 1941, Charles Evans Hughes issued this warning: "You may think that the Constitution is your security. It is nothing but a piece of paper. You may think that the statutes are your security. They are nothing but words in a book." Unquote. Even the elaborate mechanism of government depends upon sound and uncorrupted public opinion for proper support. Seeds for writing Last Witness were planted when Erica Hart, editor, attended the dedication ceremony of one of the internment camps, Camp Manzanar, honoring it as a National Historic Site. 50 years prior to that return visit, she had experienced the camp as a first grader, while her mother Dorothy was employed there as a counselor for the War Relocation Authority. Created in 1942 ostensibly to administer the camp and aid its occupants, in reality the department was probably designed simply to relieve the Army of its Japanese problem, since in retrospect it proved to be rather ineffective. Hart was kind enough to send me a copy of an article she wrote for the autumn 1993 Massachusetts Review entitled Children of Manzanar. In it she recalls some memories of that one year, her unquestioning acceptance of the situation, and her pleasure at being considered brighter than her friends, her classmates. Mention is made of the attempt to present Manzanar and the other internment camps as miniature American communities, complete with their own schools, churches, libraries, hospitals, and newspapers, and Hart saved some of these newspapers. She recalled the ironies as well. Rituals such as the daily salute to the American flag and the singing of patriotic songs, all undertaken while viewing barbed wire, fences, watchtowers, and armed guards. Although uncomfortable about her mother's role a half-century before, Hart felt compelled to make the pilgrimage and had a great desire to reconnect with former classmates, none of whom had remained in her life. Reunited, she was unexpectedly delighted by their warmth and acceptance, bonding with them as one of the camp's survivors. Her physical presence back at that site with her former classmates deeply affected her. She, by the way, is a professor of women's studies, foreign languages at Brandeis. This is totally unrelated. This is personal. She began to understand the impact of that year. Like her Nisei friends, which are second-generation Japanese Americans born in the United States with citizenship status, she understood that camp was synonymous with pain, isolation, shame, abandonment, silence, humiliation, guilt, family separation, and lack of civil rights. She could not help but conclude that Manzanar was an American concentration camp for people who, it was later confirmed, had committed no wartime act of sabotage or espionage, and that unlike many of her contemporaries and World War II gung-ho supporters like Tom Brokaw, memories of those years failed to evoke in her a burst of patriotism. She has one essay in here, one of the 17. Her personal essay is entitled Democracy for Beginners, and in it, she writes of her own suspicions of democracy. And as negative as she and her classmates are about the internment, the camp experience. Norman Y. Mineta, whom you know, the first Asian American cabinet member under Clinton, he was the Secretary of Commerce, he's the current Secretary of Transportation. He contends that the stigma of disloyalty was even worse. Although this is a story we would rather not hear, writes Harth, the American public must be informed in order to protect minorities from the will of the majority when the latter chooses to victimize the former. Thus she invited 16 others, carefully selected contributors as representative last witnesses to the internment, to share their stories and perspectives in order to further the causes of social justice and human rights in the 21st century. Within the book's 4 chapters, which are entitled Parents and Children, Family Secrets, What We Took from the Camps and From the Past to the Future, former internees and children of internees and camp officials reveal somewhat reluctantly, by the way, ways in which they were personally affected. The perspectives of these people include personal pain and suffering, family upheaval, journeys to research the camp where they were born and lived, the difficulties of the younger generation of Japanese Americans who, although totally innocent, must deal with the implications of the internment on them and their families. Some of the essays dwell more on the political aspect, while others focus on the topic of the internment in the world of literature and theater, which I think many of you will enjoy. But the primary purpose of this anthology, she explains, is to establish a compact between these writers and members of the younger generation, to inform readers that all Americans were affected by what she calls one of the most significant betrayals of American ideals, and to remind them of the fragility of democracy and individual freedom. In her introduction, she writes, "You will read our stories and hear our voices, but not in silence. If the history of the incarceration is to influence the future, you, the young, must constantly renew its stories with dialogue, reflections, active engagement with the issues, and conscience. Only by honoring this trust will you succeed in making the event outlive its witnesses and outwit the eternal return of myth. For," she says, "it is voice, not silence, that will ultimately protect us," unquote. And it is Erica Hart's voice and her intimate involvement at Camp Manzanar that we anticipate on Thursday. As always, go prepared to listen, but also to ask her those questions you feel remain unanswered. Be sure to purchase your copy for her to sign at the veranda, but more importantly, for you to learn of the plight of less fortunate fellow citizens right here in our own country. Thank you. Are there any questions? The property of the Japanese returned to them after the war. They were not allowed to return to the West Coast. This is what the War Relocation Authority was set up to do, to move them inland, to move them to the Midwest. And as far as the compensation, how could you ever regain what you lost? No, I'd say primarily no. She lived it. She was there, she lived it, but she was only in first grade. So any specifics of the camp, I think, are good questions for her.